So you're there, but you eventually make it back here. So talk about that transition and talk about your time here at Motorola.
So, couple things. I'd lived there for a while, and my dad ended up getting cancer, and wanted to come back for that, and ended up getting a job at Motorola. That was about 2002, and came back, and of course, as it would happen, I was hired to do a job to build sort of an iTunes for Java games on mobile phones. And of course, 1 month after I got back, my boss got promoted, the entire strategy changed, and they were kind of, okay, now what am I going to do? So they said, well, my boss sat me down at Motorola and said, well, Nokia phones make more money for the operators that buy it than Motorola phones.
So talk about, I think this is important for people who, since the iPhone has changed this so much, for people who may not have remember the world pre-iPhone because it really has changed. Talk about who the customer was, because I remember being at Motorola and them really talking about the fact that they weren't able to build just for the consumer. Right. Explain that dynamic, and then let's talk about the story.
So, in those days, basically when you used to buy a phone because of the hardware, that was the value proposition, and Motorola was really good at that, sort of culminating in the Razr.
Small, good telephony.
Yeah, I mean, it was good at what it did. The software wasn't great, but it didn't have to be because there wasn't a user behavior that expected that. And then the iPhone came out, and that changed everything. And that single-handedly changed the way, first of all, it vaulted the United States back into the leadership position single-handedly, completely changed the dynamic of how you buy phones and who's got sort of the power in the system. Whereas we used to build a phone when we were at Motorola that was per the specs of the Verizons and the AT&Ts. I
think that's important. Your customer was the product manager at Verizon.
Yeah, absolutely.
Not what even if you could build a phone consumers would buy.
Yeah. Because it was crucially important to their business that they had a differentiated phone offering, because people bought the subsidized phones, and that was where their what they call the net add subscribers came from, and that's where their business was built on. So they had to make the right choices about which phones at which price point. They were the customers.
I think this is a really important one for founders. As you think about a company, that example is a really interesting one, which is who's your buyer, knowing who your buyer is. I mean, clearly your user, in this case, was a consumer, but your buyer was the mid-level bureaucracy of these wireless carriers. And so people who innovated, I know a number of people at Motorola who did really interesting innovations, but this question of knowing who your buyer is versus your user is kind of a painful lesson to learn, because you can build the thing that users will love, you can test it, and people will go, God, I wish I could buy this. But if the person who's your buyer in that big corporate organization isn't seen in their interest to do it, it doesn't matter. And I think that has an interesting impact on innovation.
It is, and it matters a lot depending on who your buyer is. I personally, having seen both sides of that, I like consumer. Because essentially, let the best product win. And Steve Jobs would talk about this a lot. He doesn't want to build an incredible product and then, leave it to some idiot who's having a bad day on whether or not it's going to be taken up or bought.
Right, or their incentive is to find a lower cost thing because they have some financial target or whatever. Right. It's the whole idea of you're getting your signal directly from the consumer or reflected off the buyer. Right. And a lot of noise comes in when you signal noise problem.
But the interesting thing that's happening right now is that all of the cool stuff from consumer is starting to be recognized as valuable for enterprise. So now enterprise startups are all the rage because there's so much, decades worth of cruft and crappy products behind the scenes companies use. They're starting to recognize the value of social networking inside the enterprise and other things.
I think
so
that's right.
That seems
those
to be
of us in
now.
enterprise companies really appreciate it. It's like we've been like this, we've been less cool until now. All of a sudden now it's very, it's got to be cool. Talk about Motorola though, because Motorola in the 90s and early 2000s, Motorola was a hot company, a hot technology company. You had an interesting experience there. Now, if you look at the last 5 or 10 years, you don't necessarily think of them as being on the cutting edge. But talk a little bit about what you did there, because it seems like you really had a fascinating set of opportunities and experiences.
Yeah, well, the interesting thing was, so I told you about getting sat down and, Nokia phones make more than Motorola phone, so how are we going to fix that? It's only like the biggest problem that the entire industry was trying to solve, and my boss was saying, go take care of that for me, will you? So anyway, I had some ideas about, I had an idea related to something that we ended up calling Screen 3, which is basically when you turn on your phone, and again, remember, this is way before iPhone came out. This is when you did nothing but text and call on your phone. Basically, you turn on your phone, and suddenly you'd get kind of like an ESPN ticker along the bottom that you could program to your favorite channels. And it was, at the time, it was a novel idea. And we ended up taking that idea. It was a startup within Motorola that we went from me to 200 people working on it, and we sold it around about a dozen mobile operators around the world, and about 10 million users. So it was a big deal, but the interesting part about that was it was such a tough road because the culture in Motorola was about selling the boxes to the operators. And I'm saying, well, there's some really cool new stuff that you can do with the software. And by the way, they're going to like it too. It's going to differentiate you. And you end up spending, 70% of your time politicking to get an idea, accepted up the chain. And I ended up having to go to the CFO at the time of the Motorola mobile devices and saying, there's a cool new idea. And he said, how much do you need? And I said, $7 million to build it and to get it out there. He said, well, how much does it cost to build? I said, $4 million. He said, all right, I'll give you $4 million. I said, well, it's the other $3 million that's going to actually get the return on this. And he said, well, go get a customer. So I ended up having to go out and run around to get customers and the operators interested in this idea. And we ended up getting so many customers interested in it that they were demanding it in devices that were earlier on the sort of shipping schedule. Mm-hmm. So I was getting in trouble because the customer wanted it too much. So anyway, it was an interesting cultural battle that I had to fight to take a new idea that was sort of a software-related idea and really what was at the time a hardware company. And so that was the first thing I did.
So from an innovation perspective, having been an insider and innovator there, if you had to look at Motorola and say, could they have had a different future, or was the die cast when they went there, and whatever kept them from getting there? How would you describe that for people to learn from?
So again, I would say that when the value proposition, when the iPhone came out, software became important, and they didn't really have a long-term plan for software. They had some of the wrong people running it. Interestingly, the job that I took immediately after working on the Screen 3 project was a next-generation smartphone project where I was working with Andy Rubin and Android to build the first Android phone ever. This was in 2006.
Wow.
And what ended up happening was we had these really cool phones, working closely with Google for a year, and top management ultimately came back and said, well, we're going to be dependent on Google for our software? No, we're not going to do that. So they ended up canceling the project.
So what were they going to do instead?
That was my question. That's when I ended up leaving. So, ultimately, that shift from the value proposition being hardware to software was a rough one for Motorola at the time.
I've heard people there say that part of the issue is that, when if Motorola would have tried to buy Android, they would have made Andy Rubin what do you think his position would have been inside Motorola?
Yeah, right. Like senior manager of something or other. Right. Yeah, right. That's a key point.
And at Google, what is he? I think he's the head of their whole mobile.
Yeah, now he started at either director or VP level, and he's now running the entire mobile.
That's a big cultural shift for a place like Chicago to take somebody from a startup. He must have had 50 employees when they bought him. It wasn't huge.
Oh, it was even smaller than that. I think it was in the 20s.
20s. So you buy a company with 20 employees, and in a place like Motorola, you'd say, well, okay, if you have that many people, it's like the military. If you have this many people, then you're a senior manager, right? Yeah. And at Google, they basically say, well, we don't know that much about this. You're the expert. You're the thought leader, and put that person in charge of what's significantly the future of their company. Right. That's a huge cultural difference, and it's a real credit to them. I mean, that's a bold move to take somebody who
It
has
is.
never made a profit yet and make him the the person driving
Well,
the future.
ultimately, that's why they bought Motorola instead of the other way around.
Exactly,
So.
exactly.